give our spiritual leadership permission. If there was no Bible command against cutting hair, I would certainly understand if spiritual leadership wanted to make a church standard against cutting hair. Because if you look at the history of hair, every time women began to cut their hair, it was a time of immorality and upheaval in society. So if there was no Bible command, spiritual leadership could easily make a command against it with great authority. But we don't have to make a command against it from spiritual leadership because there is a Bible command about it. But if we look at the associations of human hair in history, we will find that for the first 5,900 years of human history, no moral woman in any society cut her hair. It's only in the last 100 and some years that we've had problems with apparel and women cutting their hair and all of that kind of stuff. Women wearing men's apparel and women cutting their hair. The widespread practice of women cutting their hair began in the United States in the 1920s. It was a decade of materialism and frivolity and rebellion and immorality, and the world had survived World War I, but they paid a price. And in the 1920s, there were many articles, and I will not take time to read all of these, but U.S. citizens were all interested in this issue of bobbed hair, which was their expression for a woman cutting her hair in short styles. And there are many quotes. Marion Spitzer in the Saturday Evening Post back in 1925, she said, "There hasn't been a newspaper printed for the last 2 years that hasn't carried some sort of story about women's hair." Anne Harding in the Ladies' Home Journal in 1927 said, "The most radical change in the costume of women in our times has been the change in hairstyles. Now short hair is considered chic. It is the symbol of the freedom of women." And the number of hairdressing shops quadrupled in just 4 years. Department stores and hospitals would discharge all their employees if they were female and they cut their hair, because it was an issue of morality in the 1920s. Many men divorced their wives because they cut their hair. A Missouri court in 1926 gave custody of 3 children to private homes because their mother cut her hair. That's unbelievable. And God brought judgment on the United States at the end of that decade in 1929. The stock market crashed on Black Tuesday. I don't think that's a coincidence. A decade of immorality, a decade of upheaval, and God brought judgment on that decade. The angry decade of the 60s came back, 1960s. This year is the 40th anniversary of Woodstock, the huge music festival in the United States. And that decade brought rebellion against God, rioting and drug use and the hippie culture and unisex clothing and Eastern religion and rock and roll music and atheism and free sex and long hairstyles for men entered culture during that period of time. Started by the Beatles in 1964. Barber shops across America were forced to close at the rate of 100 a month because young men stopped cutting their hair in rebellion against the establishment. Would you notice this with me? Nearly all rebellion in society since then has been identified with hairstyles. Punk rockers, skinheads, etc. When there is rebellion, there's a hairstyle usually associated with it. So that's the historical significance of hair. But there's more than the historical significance of hair. Ladies, please honor me with your attention over the next little bit. I want to tell you some things that are very, very important to you. You bring something to the New Testament church that the men cannot bring to the church. Men and their holiness standards provide much of the spiritual offensive power. But ladies and their holiness standards provide much, if not all, of the defensive power of the church. You defend us against the enemy by your holiness, because there is spiritual significance with what you do with your hair. Now, the witches and the warlocks understand something that many Pentecostals do not understand. If Christians knew what the witches and the New Agers knew, women would not cut their hair. The Bible says there is power on the head because of what we do with our hair. And what the Lord would like to use for good, the devil wants to use for evil. So let me give you some quotes, not from our team, but from the other team. Not from the good realm of the spirit world, but from the bad realm of the spirit world. Let me look at their literature for just a moment. In the Encyclopedia of Superstition, Folklore, and the Occult Sciences of the World, page 282, quote, "Women's hair is a most precious amulet, and it wards off a great many evils and diseases." From the Power of Magic, Secrets and Mysteries, Ancient and Modern, page 74, quote, "Hair has always been considered strong magic. Witches casting an evil spell needed a piece of hair from their victims to make it truly efficacious." Women's Dictionary of Symbols and Sacred Objects, page 313, quote, "Women's hair carried heavy symbolic and spiritual significance in Oriental religions. Tantric sages proclaimed that the binding or unbinding of women's hair could control cosmic powers of creation and destruction." The Dawning International Encyclopedic Psychic Dictionary, page 269, quote, "Hair has psychical powers that act as a protection from evil entities of the etheric world. Cutting of the hair was done in a ritual to discontinue this protection. Hair is symbolic of strength. It contributes to one's personality. It is a mark of identification. To shave one's head is to remove one's self-image so one can begin a new self-image." From the Encyclopedia on Witches and Witchcraft, page 149, quote, "A witch's magical power is bound in her hair. By shaking her hair in the wind, the power of her spell is doubled." The Encyclopedia of Occultism and Parapsychology, page 572, quote, "Hair has an occult significance since ancient times. It has been regarded as a source of strength. The association of hair with sexual features of the body has given it remarkable force, and distinctions between male and female hair have emphasized sexual attraction. The unisex fashions of our permissive society and rock groups have tended to create sexual confusion and neurotic behavior." The occultists, the witches, the warlocks, they know that there is something powerful about what we do with our hair that is associated with the spirit realm. I wish Pentecostals and apostolics got this principle as much as the witches and the warlocks do. Think of the classic image of a witch in history. It is a woman with long, scraggly, uncut hair. Why? Because the evil side of the supernatural realm knows that a woman has power on her head because of what she does with her hair. I wish every apostolic understood what our enemy understands. I wish every apostolic woman understood what the witches understand, that there's power on her head because of what she does with her hair. I am not saying for one moment that hair is magic. I am not saying for one moment that your hair is an amulet. I am not saying for one moment that you can use the physical substance of your hair to cast a spell or to gain favor or power with God more than the men. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying that your submission in not cutting your hair gives you great power and authority in the spirit realm. It is the submission of what you are doing with your hair that gives you that power and favor before God. Now, it is enlightening to examine history, and it is enlightening to examine what the witches and warlocks know about hair. But it goes without saying that we don't make a standard for what our women do with their hair based on what the witches say or based on what history says. We make a standard based on what the Bible says. So with that in mind, I want to go now to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And let us take the chapter and let's put every verse in context. And let's see what Paul is saying in this passage that is so very important to us. In verse 1 he says, "Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ." And Paul teaches us not only here, but in several places in the New Testament, that we are to be an example for other believers to follow. Follow me as I follow Christ. Some people say, don't look at me, look at Jesus. They're wrong. Paul said, look at me as I follow Christ. I am not copping out. I am not going to dodge my responsibility. I will live as a Christian. So if you pattern yourself after me, you will be living as a Christian. I will be a good example. And Paul in chapter 10, he's teaching us, don't damage your witness among fellow Christians. Don't eat meat sacrificed to idols when it damages younger believers that don't understand. And chapter 11 teaches us, do not damage your witness in your culture. Ladies, Don't take off the veil in Corinthian culture, because to take off the veil in Corinthian culture associates you with temple prostitutes. So in chapter 10, he's saying, don't damage your witness among fellow Christians. In chapter 11, he's saying, don't damage your witness in our culture. And chapter 11, verse 1 is the perfect transition. Follow me as I follow Christ. I will give you a good example. The examples given in both cases, eating meat offered to idols and wearing the veil, both of those are cultural examples that apply only to Corinth. Eating meat offered to